Let us explore how meditation could actually increase your resentment. This morning's lesson is drawn from a very good-hearted question found on Reddit. The title of the question is Filled with Contempt for the Human Race. One of the things I'm going to tell you about this is, number one, it's very well written. And number two, the person writing it is not trying to make themselves look good at all. They're being very, very humble and very, very vulnerable, and they deserve our great respect for that. The person continues, I've never really considered myself a hateful or angry person, and I have been practicing the Dhamma for about 3 to 4 years now. The spelling of the word Dhamma infers that this man is practicing a variation of the Theravadan tradition. My meditation practice was going quite well until a month or two ago. I'm lately filled with general contempt and disdain for people on the basis of their immorality. So, until a month or two ago, so there's two most likely scenarios. Either A, something happened to trigger you. B, you've been enthusiastically applying poor meditation advice. Hey, man, it's not your fault you received bad advice. And the very fact that you ran with it enthusiastically speaks highly of you. But sometimes bad advice takes a while. The fruit of bad advice applied takes a while to manifest. Or it could be a combination of all of the above. Let's continue. I'm lately filled with general contempt and disdain for people on the basis of their immorality. As a person who was just generally kinder and more understanding than most people in early childhood to now, keeping the 5 precepts rather strictly, albeit not perfectly, and generally doing my best to be the most moral person I can, constantly trying to be generous and patient with others, constantly trying to dismiss anger and hatred when people behave in foolish or immoral ways. So we can't do that. Using our prefrontal cortex to argue with our limbic system is like trying to teach a pig to sing. It wastes your time and it annoys the pig. But even more than that, it's like trying to pound finishing nails with Waterford crystal. It's not going to do a very good job on the nail, and it's going to do a terrible number on the Waterford crystal. There are better, more efficient ways of dealing with anger than telling ourselves stories. And often the stories we tell people in an effort to mitigate our anger wind up biting us in the ass. Let's continue. Recalling that they are ignorant, they don't understand the suffering they are creating for themselves and so forth. So this is one of those things if we tell ourselves this type of story, it's going to sow the seeds of disdain. People don't act cruelly because adults do not act cruelly because they don't understand the consequences of their actions. They act cruelly because they are stuck in their amygdala. We'll get back to that later on. But peer-reviewed studies have demonstrated that the more peril someone experiences, the more their underbrain lights up. Whereas the more abundance and safety they experience, the more their forebrain lights up. So an increase in immorality and cruelty is more of an indictment on late-stage capitalism than it is on the wisdom of the people falling prey to it. I am lately finding myself having a very difficult time cultivating a peaceful mind, and we'll get to that in a moment. The reason why my mind cannot properly settle seems to be, and I'm going to stop right here. I'm glad you used the word seem. And by the way, it's not my job to beat you up and jump all over you. It's my job to treat you the way a school of piranhas treat an unfortunate capybara who has fallen into the wrong Amazonian tributary. But I'm trying to help you as best I can. Sometimes with the best of intentions, we tell ourselves a story. I'm having trouble because of X, Y, and Z. But that just creates more rigidity and more certitude, which creates more problems than it fixes. I will return to that. Let's continue. The reason why my mind cannot properly settle seems to be that I am filled with conceit, disdain, and general contempt and derision for most people now. I feel like I can spot their defilements fairly easily. In my life, I've fallen for two cults. One labeled itself Christian, the other labeled itself Buddhist. Both relied on forms of coercion in the evangelizing of potential members and in the counseling of actual members. And an integral part of that coercion was predicated upon denying others the benefit of the doubt in an effort to browbeat them into submission. This is universal in all cults and many social groups. Like a curious cat who's explored the interior of an empty bag of Doritos and is having trouble backing its way out. It took me many years to break that habit of denying others the benefit of the doubt with an ulterior, quasi-spiritual motive. It is something you can undo, I assure you. And by comparison to the Buddhist community, most people seem like little more than dumb animals to me, not on the basis of intellect, but in terms of wisdom and morality. I also am finding it generally difficult to cope with being around non-Buddhist people. My mind often proliferates something along the lines of, I'm so much better than you in almost every conceivable way. You couldn't even begin to fathom my wisdom and understanding if you tried. I'm so much more morally upright than you. Once again, I really respect the vulnerability and the self-mockery. Well done. Well done. Anyways, so I'm mainly posting this just to see if anyone has any relevant advice or suttas, as opposed to scolding, are dealing with these feelings and mental states. Yes, I do. Buckle up. In the words of Betty Davis, we're in for a bumpy ride. There are significant problems for me, and my general love for humanity has become pretty low. Part of it may, of course, be the general cultural degradation of morality in North America that appears to be rapidly accelerating, especially since 2020. I do feel like humanity is on a pretty bleak trajectory towards abject morality and shamelessness. But regardless of how realistic this perception may be, the fact remains that the associated conceit and contempt I feel towards others is not exactly helping the situation. So well done on the person who wrote this. Let us begin with broad brushstrokes. Sturgeon's law reminds us that 90% of everything sucks, but not in the fun, tingly way. Therefore, it should come as little surprise that 90% of meditation instruction is terrible. Seldom is it malicious, but still it is often sincerely terrible. And it results in false mindfulness, meditation, morality, and wisdom. Let's explore each of these through the lens of neuroscience. Beginning with false mindfulness. The majority of contemporary meditation teachers describe mindfulness in terms of actively watching something. They use it as a synonym for concentration. The very great problem is that when we rely on such neurological structures as the medial prefrontal cortex or the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to either actively concentrate or actively analyze, our blood is going to, according to fMRI studies, functional magnetic resonance imaging studies, our blood mass will collect, or more precisely, this area here will light up. This lumpy thing known as the amygdala, which functions as the seat of our aggression and anxiety, located in the metaphoric dungeon of our limbic system. This is all short term. If we persist in an over-reliance on our prefrontal cortex in the long term, it's going to create an exhaustion that could present with symptoms of depression. And let's face it, no one turns to meditation because they're experiencing a deficit of rage or terror or despair. People want the opposite. They want peace and love and joy. And so it's darkly, darkly ironic that when it's done incorrectly, we get dire results. So now that we know what not to do, let's explore what to do. All we have to do is learn how to cooperate with the mechanisms in our central nervous system that are already wired to help us cope with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Every time we inhale, whether we know it or not, we access our sympathetic nervous system, ensconced within the thoracic or central third of our spinal cord. It has not evolved to support either extreme of mind blanking or active concentration. What has our sympathetic nervous system evolved to support? It has evolved to help us perceive, and to do so vulnerably, passively, viscerally, and randomly. Approximately 100, so in the lore of the Theravada, a tale is told that before the Buddha was known as the Buddha, he was known as Gautama. And Gautama's wicked cousin was Devadatta. And Devadatta thought it would be a marvelous thing to be rigid, fearful, controlling, elitist, cryptic, competitive, and cruel. Whereas Gautama felt the opposite, that it was much better to be flexible, loving, laid back, egalitarian, lucid, cooperative, and kind. Our sympathetic nervous system is about perceiving vulnerably, passively, viscerally, and randomly. Anything else is using different parts of our central nervous system to our detriment. We never feel quite as vulnerable as when, in the words of a young Eddie Murphy, we're butt naked on a zebra. Which is probably why Samantabhadra and Samantabhadri are depicted as naked in this image, to remind us of the vulnerability necessary for mindfulness. Let's explore this a step further. We have evolved to perceive sights, sounds, sensations, flavors, scents, and the like. We have also evolved to perceive emotions, intentions, thoughts, memories, and imaginings. Now, we are not digital computers. We are analog, squishy things, and therefore we perceive spectrums. Everything from the external to the internal, from the physical to the mental, from the pleasurable to the painful, from the interesting to the boring, from the glorious to the grotesque. With such a vast amount of things to notice, it can feel overwhelming. And so the question is, how can we cope with all that we perceive? That brings us to false meditation. As I mentioned previously, many poor teachers convince their students that what they really need is pseudo-intellectual active analysis. Whether it's active analysis of impermanence or selflessness or birthlessness or deathlessness or just how people cannot be blamed for their misdeeds because they're so damn ignorant. But we've already explored how active analysis and its consequential reliance or over-reliance on structures of our prefrontal cortex have a terrible effect on our central nervous system. Having reminded you of that, and possibly insulted your intelligence, and of course I apologize, allow me to share with you the autonomic nervous system's elegant response to the stress we might experience due to perception. Every time we exhale, whether we know it or not, we are accessing our parasympathetic nervous system, ensconced within both the lower as well as upper thirds of our spinal cord, including our, I have trouble pronouncing this, our reticular activating system. This has evolved, this parasympathetic nervous system has evolved to support both physical relaxation as well as mental release. This is the key to the wisdom of letting go. Not thinking deep thoughts, but simply allowing the mechanisms of our autonomic nervous system to help us. We don't resent the 3 tubes in our inner ear that are responsible for maintaining our equilibrium. Let us not resent the existence of our autonomic nervous system, which has evolved to give us emotional equilibrium. So I started off by mentioning how an over reliance upon active concentration and active analysis can cause the amygdala region of our underbrain to light up like a Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade, or like the Disney Main Street Electrical Parade. No, I've got that song going through my head from the commercial. So here's a really cool thing. When instead of overusing our prefrontal cortex, we rely upon our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems to perceive and release, something amazing happens. This area stops lighting up. And instead, this area lights up. This thing that looks kind of like a catcher's mitt. This thing that the cool kids refer to as the anterior cingulate gyrus. This thing that functions as the hub of our mirror neurons, the seat of empathy and compassion and love. This is why the greatest Dzogchen Lamas of Tibet have insisted that the highest love is spontaneous and uncontrived. Dynamo we think it is. What is the dynamo we think it is? Simply this. Noticing and releasing in harmony with our inhalation and our exhalation. What the Buddha described as the seventh fold and the eighth fold of the Eightfold Path is the key to love, spontaneous and uncontrived. It is the key to patience. It is the key to forgiveness. So rather than fight our resentment or our anger, we can be honest with it. We can be vulnerable with our darker, more unpleasant emotions as we breathe in. For we have a safety valve. We are already wired to release them physically and mentally as we relax into our exhalation. This is the key to patience. This is the key to forgiveness. Not telling ourselves stories of others' ignorance or also inferring our own superiority or that of our teachers. Story is not the panacea we have been told it is. Our autonomic nervous system is, however, that panacea. So let's discuss false morality. When we rely upon willpower, upon our dogged determination to keep rules, that is but an analog of morality. It is not the real thing. You can go to the store and find an analog of a tomato. It looks like a tomato. But when you get it home, it doesn't smell like a tomato, and it doesn't taste like a tomato. It's an analog. Meanwhile, you can go over the weekend to the farmer's market and buy a real tomato. It's ironically might not be as pretty as the one in the store, but it smells like a tomato and it tastes like a tomato. True, 50% of the Buddha's Eightfold Path pertains to loving kindness. The second fold of the Buddha's Eightfold Path is right aspiration, or wishing love. or mental morality. The third fold of the Buddha's Eightfold Path is kind communication or interpersonal morality. The fourth fold of the Buddha's Eightfold Path is kind conduct or physical morality. The great Karma Jigme of Tibet insisted that the essence of the hundreds of praktimoksha vows, forgive my pronunciation, is simply non-violence. The fifth fold of the Buddha's Eightfold Path is kind commerce, not being like the proverbial Karen, forever trying to get people fired, not being like the proverbial Chad, forever trying to drive other concerns out of business. Instead, being defined by kindness and cooperation. The impetus, the engine that drives true morality is empathy. The empathy that is generated effortlessly by a regular practice of mindfulness and meditation, of noticing vulnerably, passively, viscerally, and randomly, and then physically relaxing and mentally releasing. Over and over and over again during each inhalation and during each exhalation. Whether you do it for 5 minutes every 12 hours or 60 minutes every 12 hours or 4 hours a day, whatever knocks your socks off. That is the engine that drives true morality. But, you might say, those four things are vague. How are we to know what to do or say or choose, how to do it, and when to do it? The answer is going to be weird. Consider, if you will, two extremes and happy medium. On one extreme, we have contrivance. And we've learned so far that doesn't work as well as they told us would. You know, rule keeping and whatnot. On the other extreme, we have scattered spontaneity. You know, that's like that so-called good idea that you think you get after your third consecutive espresso in 30 minutes. The happy medium between these two extremes is not scattered spontaneity, but centered spontaneity. And it is the effortless byproduct of mindfulness and meditation. Arguably, the seventh and eighth folds of the Buddha's Eightfold Path are the dynamo that manifests, that drive the remaining six folds of the Eightfold Path. So specifically, it is the mindfulness and meditation that create the effortless effort of centered spontaneity. The sixth fold of the Buddha's Eightfold Path. But what about false wisdom? Okay, the first fold of the Buddha's Eightfold Path is right view, which is diabolically vague. Now, I was taught for many years that was a reference to selflessness. But it turns out it's not. When you read the Anapanasati Sutta or the Satipatthana Sutta or the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, selflessness or no self or not self is not mentioned at all. You know what is mentioned? Change. impermanence. So here's the really, really cool thing. We don't need a doctorate in divinity. We don't need a PhD in philosophy. Everyone sees change all the time. You can't make it to adulthood without having seen the changing of the seasons and thus observed the impermanence of a year, without having observed the waxing and the waning of the moon and thus observed the impermanence of a month. You cannot make it to adulthood without observing the rising and the setting of the sun and thus observe the impermanence of a day. And even now we can gingerly rest the tips of our fingers upon our upper rib cage. As we inhale, we can feel it swell. As we exhale, we can feel it sink. And viscerally, we can feel the impermanence of our breath. Ever changing one and all, there is nothing permanent to grasp. Whether we perceive change subtly or jarringly, despite our best attempts, we cannot help but perceive change. We see changes, we hear changes, we feel changes, we taste changes, we smell changes, and the like. We cannot help but observe the ever-changing nature of our emotions and intentions and thoughts and memories and imaginings. A visceral realization of impermanence is an effortless and involuntary byproduct of mindfulness, the seventh fold of the Buddha's Eightfold Path. But what about selflessness? What about the wisdom realizing emptiness? Simply this. Check this out. Every time we relax into our exhalation, whatever we noticed during our previous inhalation could feel a little bit less permanent, could feel a little bit less solid, could feel a little bit less defining. Now, since all complex animals upon this planet have evolved to think symbolically, let's throw in the figure of speech or two, shall we? Every time we relax into our exhalation, whatever we noticed during our previous inhalation could feel as if it was as non-graspable as a vast, empty void. Now, any good English teacher will remind us that a simile is only as useful as it is relatable. So we must ask, what is a real-world example of a non-graspable, vast, empty void? How about the illusion, the infinite azure sky on a bright and beautiful cloudless morn, which, although could be tantalizing to the eye, is non-graspable to the hand. And so there you have it. Every facet of the Buddha's path can be organized according to the Eightfold Path, which is driven by the beating heart of mindfulness and meditation, including morality, including wisdom. Allow mindfulness and meditation to be the dynamo that drives your morality and your wisdom, and life is going to be so much easier. Rely on story and concentration, and you'll continue to be cranky and uptight and miserable. And nobody wants that. I do look forward to now putting this into action, to practicing this with you after approximately 30 seconds of housekeeping. This is Lama Jigme Gyatso of the Buddha Joy Meditation School. For more than 30 years, I spent about 8 hours a day, almost every day, studying, practicing, mastering, and reverse engineering the teachings and techniques of each sect of Buddhism so that you would not have to. Welcome, my friends, to Meditate Like a Jedi, which is made possible due to the generosity of viewers just like you. Welcome to the latest iteration of Love and Letting Go. Yes, right mindfulness and meditation are the dynamo that drive our marathon race, our cross-country event. But I've never met an athlete who gets out of the car and just starts running. Everyone warms up. We're going to warm up with 8 passive contemplations, 4 of loving kindness and 4 of impermanence. These are not a substitute for mindfulness and meditation, but they're a great way to warm up. Now, I'm going to be really, really blatant. If all you practiced was right mindfulness and right meditation, that would be enough. Unless you, like me, have ADHD. If you have problems regulating your dopamine, then I recommend intermittently playing with passive contemplation to kind of stimulate it so you don't fall asleep, slip into a coma like Garfield. But if you are neurotypical and you don't have a problem with ADHD or with dopamine or anything like that, then you can just hang out with mindfulness and meditation. I am disabled. I have all kinds of things wrong with my body and brain, and so I've had to practice the Dharma in a way that meets my unusual needs and the needs of those who are kind of drawn to me. I'm pretty much like, just as a fresh poop gathers unto itself blue bottle flies, neurodivergent meditators are drawn to me. So let's begin by bringing the 4 bases of mindfulness, the circumstantial, the physical, the interpersonal, and the mental, into the paths of stress and loving kindness. Please chant with me. That is so weird. Since we are not alone in our mental frustrations, we could also long that others' mental needs also be met. So, we're going to take all these words and reduce them down to just 2 syllables. The first of which we shall recite during our inhalation, the second of which we shall recite during our exhalation. No, Virginia, our job is not to actively visualize or concentrate or emote or believe. We're simply playing with these words silently, mentally, and passively in harmony with our phases of breath. And as such, exercising the various neural pathways and giving ourselves just a little dash, just a little scotch, sprinkle. Pinch, that's it, pinch, just a little pinch of dopamine. Now, I think it could be fun is if we practice this for 4 rounds, assuming a round is simply 1 inhalation followed by 1 exhalation. So please count with me in the following manner. During each inhalation, please advance the tip of your left thumb upon the creases and tip of your left little finger. Let's practice together. In the numerical discourses of the Buddha, he had high praise for the benefits of training in loving kindness. Please chant with me. Since we are not alone in our interpersonal frustrations, we could also long that others' interpersonal needs could also be met. Please join me in counting the next 4 rounds upon the creases and tip of our left ring finger. Since we are not alone in our physical frustrations, we could also long that others' physical needs also be met. And of course, we cannot help but let our minds wander, not only to our neighbors and family members, but the folks who are experiencing profound physical needs in Gaza and Jordan and the Congo. Let us count our next 4 rounds upon the creases and tip of our left middle finger. Since we are not alone in our circumstantial frustrations, we could also long that other circumstantial needs also be met. So we can use the 1-syllable word boon as a synonym for good fortune. Let us count our next 4 rounds upon the creases and tip of our left index finger. So congratulations, you've learned the rudiments of Bengali crease counting. You've learned how to count 16 rounds on the fingers and thumb of your left hand. But did you know that on your right hand you could count sets? So we've already counted our first set of 16 rounds, and now we can begin our second set of 16 rounds. For our next 4 exercises, let us bring the 4 bases of mindfulness into the paths of impermanence and not self. Excuse me. Oh. Okay. Together. Observing the coming and going of appearing circumstantial phenomena helps us to see it, however changing one and all, there is nothing permanent to grasp. we're using the word lot as a synonym for circumstance. Feeling the coming and going of sensual physical phenomena. Help us to feel, however, changing one and all, there is nothing permanent to grasp. We can use the word forms as a synonym for bodies. Just as the Buddha's hands rest comfortably in his lap, while playing with Bengali crease counting, I recommend we take our hands out of the air, just rest them in the lap as well, for doing so is more ergonomically sound. Listening to the coming and going of resounding interpersonal phenomena. Help us to hear, however, changing one and all, there is nothing permanent to grasp. Our experience, we can use the word feels to denote our experience of the interpersonal. Noticing the coming and going of lucid mental phenomena. Help us to clearly perceive, however, changing one and all, there is nothing permanent to grasp. One of the cultural elements of South Asia is that certain conical structures have come to symbolize the Buddha's enlightened mind, even though the Buddha never mentioned this in his discourses. It's just come to be. Now, quick heads up. If you've listened to the opening discourse, then you heard me share things with you that might be contrary to what you've heard before. The test of my techniques is not how popular they are, but the results you get when you apply them for as little as 5 minutes every 12 hours. For 7 consecutive days. If after 7 days you are crankier and more judgmental, then I probably suck and you should find a better teacher. If, however, my teachings are beneficial to you, you're welcome to keep coming back to these live streams. I stream approximately every 12 hours or so. And if for some reason you don't live in and your time zone is not coordinated with my time zone, YouTube does a pretty good job of saving my live streams. For the next 14 sets of 16 rounds, let us bring whatever we spontaneously notice into the paths of awareness and release. Our brain can be as uncoordinated and klutzy as Urkel. But when we ask our brain to silently and mentally recite the demonstrative pronoun this during our inhalation, we can find that our brain starts cooperating even more efficiently with our sympathetic nervous system. Similarly, when we ask our brain to silently and mentally recite the one-syllable verb ease during our exhalation, we could find that our brain more effectively cooperates with our parasympathetic nervous system. Every time we inhale, whether we know it or not, we are wired to generate a vertical traction between our tush and our head. Every time we exhale, that traction could release. Let us seal this morning's practice by percussively chanting loving wishes for universal enlightenment and well-being. May all minds clear yet and permanent be as enlightened as a Buddha's mind. May all relationships resounding yet impermanent be as loving as a Buddha's speech. May all bodies sensual yet impermanent be as beautifully healthy as a real or imagined Deva's form. May all circumstances appearing yet impermanent be as safe and abundant as a real or imagined Devi's land. If you feel that I have earned it, you could give this live stream a thumbs up. You could even help support this channel. In approximately 10.5 hours, I would very much like to return to lead today's evening meditation class and group practice. And if you are as geeky as me, may the Force be with you always.